All right, people, fair. Let's take another walk. Let's talk on when the soul has been infiltrated by torment or seducing spirits or anything that's corruptible or that is of corruption. We're talking about unclean spirits. We're talking about um, wicked spirits. We're talking about perversion spirits or perverse spirits. We're talking about things of that nature that was never meant to enter to inside the soul. But once they get inside there, they go and all out. It's an all out assault against love from infiltrating, building up barriers, building up parameters, building up coverings, building up different um, ways of protection for love not to enter into the soul. That's once anything is unclean, that is wicked, that is unimaginable, that's not love based, that's not from the heavenly Father, gets inside the soul. It wants to put up this covering to keep love out. Or if love is there, it wants to get all that love out. So it would, in other words, it would do one or two. It would do one or two things. It would direct us into ways that those unclean spirits would lead us in places where we would basically pour our love into places where love is not welcome. But nonetheless, it does two things. It gives the situation that has no life nourishment, but at the same time, it depletes the host that's withholding love. So now, which is the sole purpose of that unclean spirit to go inside there. Now, once love is out of the soul is ripe for a hostile takeover. Why? This is where fear forms into this image, and once it's in there, it plants the illusion over the soul. So therefore, now everything that the soul is going to do is going to walk to the beat to perform or to basically to uh, to give all the components to bring this image of fear to life, right? So one of the key areas that it wants to attack first of the soul is the imagination. All right, the soul consists of the mind, the will, the emotion, the intellect, and the imagination. Let's work our way backwards forward. We're gonna start off with this first introductory. We're gonna talk about the imagination. How important is the imagination? Let's go back to the book of Genesis. When God created man, he said, let us create man in our likeness and in our image. In other words, within that image, there's a it's like a reflection of God. So whatever is in God is in them. How God saw it fit, that's how they was. So if God saw that it was good that he made man, or when he looked over man and said it was good or it pleased God. So in other words, nothing about man was incomplete. Man was full intact that through the custom of his body was made to be impervious to anything that can bring forth uh, corruption, bring forth vulnerability, or so forth, right? So the body was intact. Then he went into the soul. The soul was intact, right? The mind, will, emotion, intellect, and imagination. It was consumed with his love. That's why it could never have known it was naked. There was no way for it to know because it was up under the love of God. The love of God is the voice of God, it's the presence of God. So it was up under that dispensation. And then the spirit was alive that it can reproduce what God produced, or it can do what God did. All it just needed was the command of God to do it. That's equivalent to what Jesus was doing on the earth. Jesus said, I don't do anything unless I only do what I saw my Father do. So if the Father don't tell him what to do or show him what to do, whatever, Jesus is not doing it. That's how Adam was. He was one and the same, just like that, because they had the same spirit. He wasn't born of God. He was born of the dust of the ground. God breathed in him. He breathed into his nostrils. He became a living soul. But his spirit wasn't born of God. So in other words, even with that, he's made a little lower than God. Jesus was above us because, in fact, he was born of the Spirit of God, even though he dwelt in a mortal flesh. He could have came down as an angel, in other words, to be somewhat as light. Well, we really can't really discern, but we needed something of one of our own kind to see it, or not just that. The own kind needed to take on the penalty of what was done by Adam. Adam did the penalty. So if Adam brought in the to be for mankind to be penalized, a man has to atone the rightful sins of that. So Jesus in the came into the flesh, being 100% of God, but being in 100% of a body, he atoned the sins. But that's the separation between us and that's the difference between Adam and us with Jesus. That's the difference. Jesus was in a body like Adam was and like we are, but he was born of the Spirit of God. We was not. Adam was not. We were not. So, with that being said, we're talking about the imagination. When an unclean spirit can get inside the imagination, or unclean thought, or a suggestion, or a seducing spirit can get inside the imagination, that it shuts down the imagination to produce an incorruptible seed. In other words, it will produce a seed that can't help but to corrupt. It's like planting a seed. Soon you see it harvest, it dies. Soon you see it grows, it dies. That's what a corruptible seed will produce. In other words, it will appear to look good, or it will have a little good in the very beginning of it, and then it dies. It's like a person that does something they're not supposed to do. So like they did something very of dishonesty. They got what they wanted off the top, but once that newness of what they got off the top goes away, they die. That what they stolen dies. So that's what an incorruptible seed does, because it didn't come from God. It has no life to sustain itself. It has only death. It only has separation from God. That's why it's death. So it dies. So if that can get inside the soul, in the area of imagination, therefore, how can the person see good for them? What a person sees, so shall they be. But you see from within. You don't see from the outset, from the outskirts of the physical lens. You see from the spiritual lens. But if your spirit is dead because of sin, or is because of the death or the fear itself inside, or the unclean spirit that's inside the soul, and it goes to the imagination, how can you imagine something greater than what you see? If you see nothing but killing, stealing, how can you imagine that there's something great and there's love in the midst of all that? You can't see it. So that's what it does. It takes away the ability to see it as God sees it. So if you could see it as God sees it, you could change that situation. Take the example of Martin Luther King. God gave him a vision. Martin Luther King told the vision, and he said the vision is, I have a dream. And he tells his vision of what he sees. He sees love. He tells the vision as love, or narrates the vision as love is the source of man, and it rules out any form of evil. That evil that it takes over any form of evil that will cause division among mankind. That was the vision that he saw. That's what he was able to. God was able to show him a vision. He was able to imagine that. Now, what makes that so powerful? It was of love, right? In the midst of that love capsule, he didn't get a chance to cross over to see it in the natural with us, walk it out with us, right? But he foreseen the ending. And if we were fast forward to today, you see little white boys and little black boys. Now, of course, that's not going to stop the enemy from trying to oppose it. Now, what he did was show the vision of God, right? That what God seen for mankind. There's another vision along with that. That there is no hatred. There's no division on the earth at all, regardless race, creed, color, tradition, nothing. There's nothing but love. So that means everything that's not on the side of love has to be removed. Because as long as there's those that can remember what it's like to be without love, or no, as long as those are those that can be okay with being without love, they will always cause a division among those with love. Love, you'll find a group of people that's in harmony. They mind their own business, right? Because they're walking in love, right? But you'll always find something from the outside, or something of someone on the inside having an unclean, corruptible spirit to come in with division. The unclean, corruptible spirit, which would be the spirit of division, and it's coming there for one reason, and that's to divide. Now, it's one thing when the Bible talks about that Jesus coming back with a sword and he's going to separate the weak. He's going to separate the house of four, two against two, well, one against three, three against one. That's a different deal. He's coming with the judgment. Judgment. He's coming with a sword. The sword of judgment is of the Father. The Father would have had enough of all the bickering of all this creation that's going up against each other. He would have had enough of it. Or mankind itself would have been crossing the grace line so much that they saying we don't want God anymore. And every time, if you were looking in the book in the Bible and different from the Old Testament all the way up, every time you see either the children of Israel or the church walk away from God, they always get into trouble. And it's not a little trouble, it's that they get taken over trouble. So when mankind in its entirety, all over the world, not just in certain regions, in certain areas, when all over the world has been crossing this grace line, God will come down with a sword. And he's coming with a sword to come to bring forth judgment. So anybody that's not on the side, or anybody that's not in the name or in the Lamb's book of life, in other words, anyone who's not in submission to God's love, God will know it because you'll be walking by his faith, right? But for order you to walk by his faith, your imagination has to be restored. So how are you going to see him in spirit and in truth if your imagination, if your soul is void of love? So in the first area that is going to strike of what an incorruptible seed or a suggestion of death or a suggestion from the pit of hell was what exactly what's the want to do is go to the first level is the imagination. Because if you could take out what you can imagine of God and what you can imagine that God wants the very best of you, that God loves you, that God will never leave you nor forsake you. If you can imagine that, what can stop you? A bullet could come your way, but don't necessarily mean it can hit you. A gang of people come kill you, don't mean they can touch you. Because if you are in imagination of God, you can actually see in the spiritual realm and you can see what's around you that you couldn't see if your imagination wasn't clear, if your imagination wasn't full of corruption. You can see the Lord of hosts around you. Right now, if you are in the righteousness of God, you have your angel around you to protect you from anything that's in the spiritual waves or the spirit waves that's trying to get to you. Remember, this war is not of flesh and blood. We know we're fighting against principalities, fighting against powers, of rulers of wickedness, of darkness in spiritual places and high places in spiritual high places. That was trying to take me through a little blender, but yeah. So we're not fighting up against flesh and blood. You know, for you to be able to beat a person of flesh and blood, that's a spiritual fight. Two people that's in love can never fight, can never physically fight, because the spirit of love that's inside of them, it wouldn't be allowed to. So you have to, for two people to fight, you have to have two different dimensions, or two different, or maybe the same level or different levels of a dark dimension inside of them. You're talking about spirits of demons and so forth, a principality, a power, ruler of wickedness in high places, and those type of demons from the underworld. You have to have that to be able to fight. Now, when God comes and does, now people say, well, God sends his army. No. God comes not to fight. He comes to bring forth judgment. In other words, he's there to bring forth order. When people fight, that's not to bring forth order. People are trying to establish their dominance. They're trying to rule a land and try to take over authority of a land. No, when God fights, he fights, he's there to bring forth order. In other words, to restore balance. So that means evil would have corrupted a place where it's not supposed to be. So he comes to restore order. But going back to the imagination, if your imagination is intact with God, in other words, if your soul is intact with God, you know, the first act of the enemy is coming towards is the imagination. If you notice, he attacks children early. Why? Because their imagination is at a high. They can see into the spiritual realm when the adult cannot. They can see things to come in the spiritual realm. If your imagination is at its high form, or if it has no involvement with anything that's corruptible, anything that's unclean, anything that's wicked, therefore it can have a foresight to see how God sees it as. how if God sees you as being prosperous or seeing you as in abundance, not with just materialistic things, but just everything about you can never it will always be invulnerable to any form of attack of anything that's there that's designed to kill, steal, and destroy you. This would say, for example, if you were to look at someone like Abraham, you would say that he has the blessing of God on him. Even to Job, for that extent, when it's the story is said that Job had a fence around about him. Where do you think that came from? That didn't come from him. If that's the case, then everybody will have that fence around him that Satan can't do anything to him, that the spiritual darkness of this world can't do anything to him. No, they came from God. How did he get that? That was his obedience to God, and that obedience was considered righteousness because you have that requires faith. Because there's one voice is telling you to be a God in your own eyes, that you don't got to do nothing. It's, do it the way you want to do it. And then there's a God. I mean, then there's a voice that tells you how to establish balance. In other words, how to bring forth not being a God in your own eyes, but how to let for everybody to have equality or for equality. Then let's say it that way. There's a spirit of selfishness. Then there's a spirit of equality that wants to bring forth everybody gets their share. So Job saw that. Job saw it as an opportunity for everybody to get his share. So he separated from things that was basically of in a place where he can have everything to himself, of selfishness. He separated from selfishness, and he became into the arms of God, where his imagination was able to see things that God can show him how to do something that, of course, on his own he probably couldn't know how to do, and it prospered because he's in obedience to God. That's the same thing with a person. If I were to give you this question, which is greater, $1 or $100, which would we say was most valuable? On the average, the person would say $100 is more valuable because they were told what $100 can do. So in other words, they only have a sight enough to see what $100 can do. It can buy $100 worth of things or a $100 thing or something like that, but it can't do anything more. No, if I can put it here, no. I'm talking about at the extent of what it can do. What it's capable of doing within its possession of itself. You could buy $100 worth of things. So a person could say, well, I could buy more things with $100 than I can with $1. Okay. Now, if that $100 is cursed, you only could buy $100 worth of things, and that's it. And once those things is bought, you're going to feel the effects of that curse. It can't do anything else besides you look at what you bought. And you're going to get tired of looking at it because it's not blessed. So you're going to want it out your sight. But with that dollar, on the other hand, you buy one thing with $1, that one thing that you buy is valuable because you're not just going to go ahead and blow it on anything. You're going to blow it on something that you consider as worth it, something that's going to sustain you for a length of time. So in other words, it's going to sustain you to a length that it will continue to be a seeding seed where it's going to continue to bless. You're not just going to put that dollar towards anything because that's the least between $100 and $1. So you're going to try to get the most out of it. That's why it becomes valuable. $100 is also often taken for granted. People say, well, no, I don't want, I'm a person that got $100 and I'm careful with my money. No, you're afraid. No, but the person with $1 is afraid. No, the person with $1 is not afraid. The person with $1 is wise because they're gonna find they're gonna find something. They're gonna buy something that's gonna sustain it. With a person with $100, what they normally do, if you were to tell a person they got 100, I will give you $100. They already spent it because they got it. Their imagination's already where it's gonna go. With $1, if you tell a person I give you $1, they're very limited to where they could place that dollar. So they don't really have much of an imagination to put it other than where they wanted to put it where it can contain a sustained flight. With that being said, my people of faith, you are the blessed. Let's be the blessing. Let's keep walking.